Good morning. Welcome to the Wilson Library Research Forum. My name is Matt Turry, and I'll be hosting today. We're going to wait just just about another minute to allow people to get here, and we'll begin at 12:02. So if you bear with us just for a second or two. Well, again, good afternoon. Welcome to Wilson Library's Research Forum. By way of just a very brief explanation, Wilson Library hosts a good number of research fellows over the course of a given year. And one of the things that we do in the wake of their research in Wilson Library is we invite them back to have a conversation with us about the materials that they looked at, the things that they found, and how it impacted their thinking about their research. This really gives us a chance to do something that we don't do as much as people probably imagine, which is to delve deeply into the content that we hold in Wilson Library as if we were researchers. Our job is a little different than that. So today we're going to have two speakers. The format is pretty consistent. So Morgan Paik will talk first for about a half hour, and then Lauren Braun-Strumfels will talk for a half hour, and then we'll come back together for 10 or 15 minutes of conversation, which is a good time for you to ask your questions. And you can do that in one of two ways. You can put your questions in the Q&A box, and we're happy to read them, or you can raise your hand and we're happy to let you ask the questions directly. All right, without further ado, let me pull up my notes and we're going to go with Morgan first. So Morgan is a second year, Morgan is a second year MA English candidate at Northeastern University in Boston. They previously received their master's in public health at UNC Chapel Hill. Her research area is 18th and 19th century literature with a focus on health humanities, public health, and disability studies. Her work in Wilson was supported by the McClendon Thomas Award, which is supported by the Billet Club Founders Endowment Fund. So Morgan was here last summer. No, she was here last winter, I think, is my memory now. Without further ado, Morgan, welcome.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Right. Yes, so I was at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, getting my master's in public health when I applied to this fellowship. So thank you. This archival project began with the argument that while institutionalization was restricted in the United States in the 1970s, the core values of the act are still present within other systems, such as prisons, conversion therapy programs, and nursing homes. I first thought of this research idea when I was sitting in one of my public health policy courses at UNC, and we were discussing the difficulties those experiencing mental health crises face in US emergency rooms. We began to see similarities between our discussions and previous research I had done on institutionalization, and found myself questioning how I could take the knowledge I had and approach an interdisciplinary project. The goal of this archival project was to examine the content of books dealing with asylums and institutions at UNC's Wilson Library's rare book collection, to understand the core pillars of institutions and asylums, as well as deepen my research on institutionalization, eugenics, and sterilization by using primary medical texts and personal accounts. My undergraduate thesis focused on these three topics, but was from a modern women's and gender studies lens and disability studies lens. So engaging with archival materials was extremely important to me. I also wanted to explore the narrative and language spread about institutions, asylums, and the people placed in them. The archival work in this project serves as the base for a comparative study of such modern day institutions. UNC's rare book collection was central to this research project due to the presence of a multitude of texts about institutions, insanity, and related diagnoses. The use of a variety of narratives was important to gaining a well rounded sense of how institutions were depicted in the 18th and 19th centuries. I chose works that involved personal narratives, medicine, and politics, which provided me with an understanding of how institutions were depicted in multiple spheres of influence. Additionally, as an interdisciplinary scholar, I found it important to examine works that related to both my public health and literature knowledge, allowing me to bring the two together. So I mainly focused on Modern Persecution by Elizabeth Packard, which was published in 1873. And then I also utilized Friends Asylum by William Rickman, a proposal for making an effectual provision for the poor by Henry Fielding, The Mind Unveiled by Isaac Curlin, and a textbook of mental and sick nursing by Robert Jones. While exploring these texts for the values and pillars of institutions, I was able to gain an understanding of the main purpose of institutions in the 18th and 19th centuries. While there were many purposes of institutions, the overarching goal of them was said to be to promote the mental recovery of patients and to provide a comfortable and healthy environment for patients that would not be able to recover. This was evident in Robert Jones' textbook titled Textbook of Mental and Sick Nursing, in which the author both instructed nurses on their responsibilities within asylums and outlined the purposes of institutions. While not expressly named, it was clear from the text I examined that another important purpose of institutions was controlling society. Those deemed unfit for being seen by society, existing within society, and contributing to society necessitated a place to be put. Within these texts, there were deep undertones of the necessity to cleanse society for the betterment of the nation. As I explored the archival texts in the rare book collection, I pinpointed these four values of institutions, which I will go more in depth about. They were isolation, nationalism and labor, morality or moral cleansing, and conforming to social expectations. So, one of these core principles was isolation, which took many different forms, from the institutions themselves to the treatment methods used on patients. Isolation was used to separate asylum patients from the rest of society by sending them away to where they could not be bothersome. This was evident in Elizabeth Packard's novel Modern Persecution, in which the author recounts her own experience of being institutionalized at the hands of her husband. In one instance, during her 3 year stay, a visitor of the asylum remarked that she must like living in the institution, to which Packard replied, "No, I do not. This is a very unnatural life, compelled to live as we do. Defenseless, exposed to abuse, separated from all our friends, and cut off from all intercourse with them, shut out from the world and all the privileges of society and citizenship, and worse than all, confined for an indefinite period." For Packard, a woman heavily involved in her community, being separated from society was one of the hardest parts of being in the institution. By isolating Elizabeth, her husband and others who disagreed with her views were able to prevent others from being exposed to what she thought. This was a key function of isolation within institutions. It was not only to prevent those institutionalized from participating in society, but also to prevent society from adopting the potentially radical views of those deemed insane. Isolation also served to weaken one's mental fortitude, which one could postulate from the books and essays involved in this project was beneficial to society and the institutions because it made inmates easier to control. William Rickman was a Quaker abolitionist, poet, and writer who was deeply involved in his community. He himself wrote a proposal to form the United States Educational Improvement Society, which promoted boarding schools and universal curriculum across schools in the United States. Rickman was also later institutionalized in the Friends Asylum, which he wrote about, critiquing the isolation he had to face while an inmate. He said that although few obscure individuals possess a more extensive and valued circles of acquaintances than myself, yet I have had very fully to experience a deprivation of their visible kindness and sympathy. Rickman expressed his belief that if he were able to have a larger social life while in the institution, his mental strength would increase. However, being isolated from his social circle only made his mental health suffer more. Another area necessitating the need for institutions and asylums is nationalism and labor. Nations wanted to stand out from one another and be better than one another, which led to wanting to better society. A nation could not be at its best if it was suffering under the weight of the poor and the insane. This is discussed in a proposal for making an effectual provision for the poor, for amending their morals, and for rendering them useful members of the society by Henry Fielding. In this text, Fielding argues why an institution is necessary in England, citing other scholars such as Locke. Here he says, numbers of men, says Mr. Locke, are to be preferred to largeness of dominions, and the reason, as he well observes, is that labor puts the difference of value on everything. Let any one consider, says he, what the difference is between an acre of land planted with tobacco or sugar, sown with wheat or barley, and an acre of the same land lying in common without any husbandry upon it, and he will find that the improvement of labor makes the far greater part of the value. I think it will be but a very modest computation to say that of the products of earth useful to the life of man, 9 out of 10 are the effects of labor. Nay, if we rightly estimate things as they come to our use, and cast up the several expenses about them, what in them is purely owing to nature and what to labor, we shall find in most of them 99 out of 100 are wholly to be put on the account of labor. In this alone, as he demonstrates, lies the difference between us and the Americans, who are furnished by nature as liberally as ourselves with all the materials of plenty, yet have not the 100th part of the conveniences we enjoy, and among whom a king of a large and fruitful territory feeds, lodges, and is clad worse than a day laborer in England. In this passage, Locke is arguing that what determines the value of a society or country is not only the amount of land or territory it has, but also the improvement of labor and how productive a country's labor is. Fielding is using this argument as well as the comparison to America, which has a lot of land, but people live in worse conditions, to argue about the necessity of doing something with the poor and having a place to put them. Fielding claims that England cannot be a better society than other places if they are not focusing on their labor productivity and finding usefulness for poor people. Therefore, this exemplifies how nationalism plays a large role in institutionalization, which is ultimately meant to make a society or country appear better than opposing ones. Fielding's arguments also show how nationalism has strong ties to labor, with the productivity of labor being an indicator of the strength of a nation. Due to this focus on labor as a source of being a productive member of society, those who are unable to work or choose not to are seen as being unfit for being part of or being seen by society. While those who could not or chose not to work were placed in institutions, asylums, and almshouses, many of them were also made to work while at these places. The importance of labor did not go away once they were away from society. Instead, it was even more impressed upon them in their new surroundings. In Modern Persecution, Packard comments on the nature of labor within institutions. She discussed how the prisoners were made to work, but if they were good laborers, was much more incentive to imprison them longer for the benefit of the institution. In this, we see how prisoners were locked away because they were deemed unfit for society, but their imprisonment was continued because they provided a service to the prison itself. This is something that will further be explored in the examination of modern day institutions. Other authors mentioned labor as well, such as Samuel Tuke, who believed that labor was the most efficient way to effect a cure for insanity. Another was Earle, who mentioned that prisoners were used as laborers so the institutions would not have to pay to have the labor done. Again, the line denoting why a prisoner was in an institution began to blur when it came to labor. These images are examples within modern persecution of labor being a benefit of the institution. Packard comments how, in her opinion, many of the prisoners are not insane but kept for the benefit of the doctor's private interests. She states, yes, all this slave labor is turns to his advantage as he reports it, thus buying their patronage, as it were, to secure his salary. This salary is thus earned for him by slaves. The use of the word slavery in these pages stands out to me because of the background that this book was published not long after the end of the US Civil War and the end of slavery. I think it highlights not only the context of what is happening in the United States around the time Packard is writing this novel, but also the complicated and long history of enslavement within the United States. Her word choice could be interpreted that she was aiming to get readers to understand that while slavery was abolished, there were still people being enslaved in different ways within the United States. It could also have been to help people understand the experience she was talking about and the magnitude of institutionalization by putting it into a context that they were familiar with. Morality and cleansing amoral people from society was an important part of the culture surrounding institutions and asylums that has been mentioned with the other values discovered in these readings. I found that within texts discussing the need to institutionalize people, disability and mental health issues were represented as social evils. In many of these texts, disability was not just talked about as a mental or physical affliction a person possessed, but something that inherently indicated whether they were a good or bad person, oftentimes in conjunction with commentary on their religious affiliation. In The Mind Unveiled, or A Brief History of 22 Imbecile Children, Isaac Curlin does this by describing disabled children as perverted or dirty. He also uses animalistic language to describe the children, their actions, and the way they speak or move. Even more so, one chapter of this book is titled Our Household Pets, which might indicate to a reader that he will be discussing the pets present at the institution he is visiting. However, he goes on to talk about two young girls, Becky and Bessie. By directly giving these two girls the title of the house pets, he is diminishing their humanity and directly showing that they are seen as unworthy of being part of society. They do not have the humanistic morals needed to be out of the institution. In the introduction, he says that within the friendly social circle, it is an eyesore spot from which everyone turns with either pity or disgust. And in the community at large, it is a burden which taxes the public purse and calls loudly for relief. There is no positive representation of the children included in this book, and both the undertones and the direct language used indicate that they are seen as moral evil unwanted in society. These are two images from The Mind Unveiled, or A Brief History of 22 Imbecile Children by Isaac Curlin. And I wanted to include them in this presentation because I thought they showed the juxtaposition between the language Curlin was using to describe the children and their actual demeanors. As I looked at this book in the archives, I found it interesting that these images were included, as I think they show a different story than the one that Curlin describes. Reading only Curlin's words, it is easy to imagine children who are running around wild and untamed. But what we see in these images is the opposite. In particular, on the left are Becky and Bessie, which Curlin described as pets. These children do not match what he has stated about them being an eyesore spot from which everyone turns. Curlin's comparison of the children also evokes imagery of a zoo, and reading this book with the accompanying images adds to that image even more so. Curlin's experience of entering the asylum and observing the children reads as an experience of walking into a zoo-like place to see creatures once unfamiliar to you. As he gawks at them and describes the way they differ from him, one could imagine that he really is looking at animals rather than children. Even more so, it is clear within his writing that he believes these children should be kept away from society, or within the metaphor, in their cages, only looked at from the outside. So in this book, each chapter was a kid, or in Becky and Bessie's case, two children. And Curlin gave like a detailed description of their behavior and why they were in the institution and how he interacted with them. And many of these chapters were accompanied with these portraits of the children, which is why it led me to think about this imagery of walking through a zoo, like reading the placard that is usually next to an animal's exhibit in a zoo. So with the need to morally cleanse society is the need for members to conform to social expectations. As Jones says in a textbook of mental and sick nursing, society makes certain rules for its own protection, to which all, and therefore each individual, are expected to conform. But when conduct deviates from the standard fixed for it by society, and there is interference either with his fellow creatures, their property, or their comfort, then the question of law-breaking or insanity, of which there are many varieties, has to be considered. This was clear within every text included in this research project, whether it was because of a physical disability, intellectual or developmental disability, being poor, old, or having beliefs outside of society's. People had to fall within the bounds of society's expectations or they would be locked away. This was especially present in Packard's Modern Persecution, in which she documented the reasons for many women being placed in the insane asylum. She noted that time after time had she seen these defenseless women sent home only to be sent back again for the sole purpose of making them the unresisting, willing slaves of their cruel husbands. Packard herself was sent to the institution for daring to speak up about her criticisms of the Calvinist Church. When her husband and others could not disprove her arguments, they schemed to send her away so others would not start thinking like her. They knew that she was an unruly woman who would not back down, and this scared them. Like Jones said, they were doing it for their own protection. While they were not in physical harm, their pride and societal standing was at stake. They could not allow a woman to outsmart them. In her novel, Packard also expressed her thoughts about the treatment of the elderly, who, in a way, also do not conform to societal expectations. Of this, she said that she could not feel that the custom of professedly barbarous nations, which allows the aged and infirm to be left in the woods to be eaten by wild beasts, was not so barbarous as this mode of disposing of unwelcome citizens, which the civilization of the 19th century has rendered popular. For the lingering, protracted tortures of dying in this institution are far more dreaded than the shorter, quicker mode of being devoured by wild bears. Packard's novel highlighted the ways in which society punished those who did not conform and questioned why it was those who were once seen as upstanding members of society could so easily be cast aside by their peers. So this presentation served as an introduction to the values of institutions and asylums and an overview of the works I examined in my research at Wilson Library's Rare Book Collection through the McClendon Thomas Fellowship. With this examination, I now have the ability to research and articulate the ways in which our modern day systems have the values and principles of institutions and asylums from the 18th and 19th centuries. I aim to use a comparative lens to make my argument, which will rely heavily on these archival texts, especially Packard's Modern Persecution. I wanted to note that while I use texts from outside the United States for the archival research, the other side of this comparative study will focus on just the United States and our public health system. I chose to include texts from outside the United States because with institutionalization from the 18th and 19th centuries, one can see the spheres of influence from European asylums. I thought it was important to look at the thought processes behind European asylums, which are congruent with firsthand accounts of asylums like Elizabeth Packard's. So a lot of the background information on how institutions were structured came from books about European asylums, but Packard's firsthand account is about an asylum in Indiana. So there's you can see a lot of the influence from Europe coming over into how the United States is structuring these systems. Additionally, with the current political climate in the United States, I hope to have a larger focus on prisons and ICE detention facilities. Since I am utilizing a public health perspective in this research, it is important to continually take into account what is happening in the United States and what public health issues are at the forefront. So in particular, the quote I read about where Packard says that this mode of disposing of unwelcome citizens, I think that's not only just related to how in the United States we treat our elderly and how our nursing homes are structured, but also how currently immigrants are being treated in these detention facilities. And of course, being a public health scholar, I think it's very important to continue looking not just at like the rights that are being violated in these institutions, but also the public health issues that are being caused because of them. And we can really see how these 19th century institutions are influencing and still happening in the United States. And that's something I would really like to focus on. And then with prisons, I think prison labor and Packard's comments and Fielding's comments on labor in institutions and how that works can be really applicable to studying how US prison systems are today. And again, the public health implications of that kind of labor and of unpaid labor in the United States. So, um, additionally, or sorry, finally, while I've not been able to work on the modern portion of this research project, I hope to continue it for my PhD dissertation. And then I also finally wanted to say that I think it's important to note that in public health, I was studying public health policy. So looking at the political and legal boundaries of the healthcare system in the United States will have a large influence on this research, and not just like what how these institutions are influencing systems today, but why they're able to be that way. Why are they set up legally? How are they able to be like that? And how are we able to continue treating people like this within our current legal system? And hopefully, looking at the two together, we can begin to see some solutions within public health on how these systems can be fixed. So, thank you for the opportunity. I think I spoke a little too quickly and went under time there. Hopefully, that's okay.
Of course, it's okay. It's hard to time these things out exactly, especially I understand nerves and sort of being very quick. So we're going to move on to our next speaker today. So Lauren is an associate professor of history at Cedar Crest College in Allentown, Pennsylvania. She's a transnational U.S. historian, and her scholarship rests stories of the American past buried in the diplomatic archives. She's the author of Partners in Gatekeeping: How Italy Shaped U.S. Immigration Policy Over 10 Pivotal Years, 1891 to 1901, winner of the Italian American Studies Book Prize in 2000, sorry, 2024, 2024, and co-editor with Maddalena Marinari and Daniela Florentino of Managing Migration in Italy and the United States, as well as a contributor. She recently published On the Border in New Orleans in Rituals of Migration, Italians and Irish on the Move, edited by Kevin Kenny and Maddalena Marinari. Her work has also appeared in Labor and the Journal of American Ethnic History. Her next book, The Forgotten Solution to America's Immigration Problem: Italians, Distribution Policy, and the South in the Progressive Era, is under contract with UNC Press and was supported by a Wilson Visiting Research Fellowship and a Peter D'Agostino Research Travel Award from the Cushwa Center for the study of American Catholicism at the University of Notre Dame. And I would just say that specifically in Wilson Library, her fellowship was funded by the John Eugene and Barbara Hilton Kay Library Fund. We're delighted to have Lauren back. And again, Lauren, thank you for coming and talking with us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Let me get my slides keyed up here. Okay. All right. So, on my title slide, right, repeat some of the information that Matt just shared, the title of my book, and thanks again to Wilson Library and to the John Eugene and Barbara Hilton Kay Library Fund for supporting this work that I conducted in June 2024. So it helped me complete the final 2 chapters of this book project, which is expected to publish in fall of 2026. And as we'll talk about today, it also inspired my next book project, which I'm writing this year with the support of a sabbatical from Cedar Crest College. So this book will be the first scholarly book to take seriously what was known in the Progressive Era as distribution policy, or the organized transfer of immigrants, particularly Italians, from crowded American cities to rural Southern farms, in a solution to what was becoming known within the nation as the quote unquote immigration problem. And a lot of this language and framing continues to resonate powerfully through the way we understand immigration and as a problem today that needs specific policy solutions, even if we distinctly disagree at what those approaches should be. At Wilson Library, I consulted 4 boxes in the Hugh McRae papers and 2 boxes in the Samuel Spencer papers, which will feature in today's presentation. In addition, I also looked at the digital collection of North Carolina newspapers that are accessible in the library, and I looked at some other material that was related to Southern railroads. So for this talk in particular, I'm going to take us on a journey that's animated by the question, how can one letter reveal so much? So as we dive in, we're going to start in the archives. Before I jump in, and I'll let you kind of get oriented to this letter, I just wanted to particularly thank librarians Matt Torrey and Sarah Carrier at UNC's Wilson Library. Thank you, Matt, for responding to my initial research inquiry with care and attention, for informing me about the Visiting Researcher Fellowship Program, and for assisting me with all the logistics required to have a successful research trip. Sarah, thanks for being a partner in the work of deciphering and sharing the record of North Carolina's past. Our many chats at the reference desk, Sarah kindly let me interrupt her many times during my week and a half at Wilson, led to a fruitful partnership, and I deeply appreciate her help in bringing the experience of authentic research discovery to my students. So thank you, Sarah and Matt. All right, so at Wilson, I looked at 2 boxes in the Spencer collection. We'll talk in a little bit more about who he is, but I kind of want to preserve the mystery a little longer. Those boxes yielded this letter, which I consider a needle in a haystack discovery that fundamentally shaped my thinking for the book that this project is that Wilson supported, and confirmed my plans for the 3rd book that I'm currently writing. Okay, so first, I've given you a little time to dwell on this letter, and hopefully you're doing some of the things that I do when I get into the archives as well. You know, some of the things that historians do in particular is just to puzzle over what it is that we're looking at here. So I uncovered this letter. As you can see, it's 2 pages long. It's short, it's handwritten, it's dated but without a year, and it says personal underlined at the top. So those details stood out to me. The greeting, Mr. Spencer, somewhat formal, right? But then the content of the letter itself, right, doesn't really give away very much. So initial impressions and clues. Some of you here on the forum today may be able to read this handwriting easily. Some of you may not. Even if you had read tons and tons of this author's handwriting, this letter still might be a bit confusing because it has some abbreviations and some references in it. Like, for instance, it talks about the presidency in that first paragraph of the B&O. What is that, right? So the question, right, that this letter really illustrates is how, as historians, and how we can handle cryptic or one-off material in the archives. Because the sort of work that I do, I'm constantly confronting this kind of material where there's really little to no context, there's no follow-up, there's no before or after, and I have to sort of puzzle out what I'm looking at here. Okay, so I'm going to go into the next slide where we can see both pages of this short letter. So our curiosity hopefully is piqued, as mine was, and we can continue to ponder what it is that we're even looking at here, right? And again, as a historian in the archives, I'm constantly confronting the question of just like, what is this? Is this important? Is this relevant? Does it connect to anything else I've seen? What other questions does it open up? What questions does it answer? What, you know, I'm always sort of kind of in this space of dwelling in the textuality of the document itself, but also in all of the other things that I've ever looked at or thought about or been curious about in connection to what I do know about this letter. So I came to this letter because the signature at the end was what I was looking for. So you might see a scrawl there. It says, yours very truly. And the signature is M.V. Richards. So we're going to spend a little time getting to know M.V. Richards in this presentation today. And I went to Wilson purposely looking for this man. I knew, right, that he was a representative of the Southern Railway. And the Southern brings in the person that he's writing to here, and that's Mr. Spencer, or Samuel Spencer, who is a really significant figure in Southern business and railroad history. So Sam Spencer was the man who formed the Southern Railway and ran it until his untimely death in November of 1906 in a railcar accident. So I knew from my prior research in Italy in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that this man named M.V. Richards had been very prolific in corresponding with the Italian ambassador and other diplomats, trying to secure Italians to buy farms along railroad lines in the South. So Richards, he called himself a land and labor agent, or sometimes the land and industrial agent of the Southern Railway. He was not the only person operating in this role for railways, but I saw him frequently in the Italian archives. And I thought, well, surely the president of the Southern Railway has something to say about what this man is doing in trying to recruit Italians from Italy to sign these contracts to purchase land and then transport them to the American South. So going to Wilson, right, I knew that I wasn't going to find a wealth of material documenting him, but I thought I'd take a look. The collection, Sam Spencer papers, are 13.5 linear feet, so like a decent sized collection. I searched through every single piece of correspondence in both dated and undated family and business papers. So that's where I found this piece. It was the last day of, of research in the library. I had to return home to my family the next day and pick up my kids, and I had still found not a single shred of evidence that linked Sam Spencer as the president to M.V. Richards. I thought it was very strange, right? I knew they had to have been talking on a regular basis. There's no way someone would be that active representing the railroad and its business interests, especially to important leaders abroad and in the United States, without, some kind of direction or approval. So that was the mystery that I was trying to solve. So I knew, so when I found this letter here, and we're going to look at the transcript in just right now. When I found this letter here, I thought, finally, here's some shred of evidence linking the two men. And I will tell you all that this is the only piece of evidence that I have found. And I went and I've also looked at the Southern Railway collection in Atlanta, Georgia, at the Atlanta History Center. We'll look at a piece come from that one in just a moment, a few slides down. So on my final day, right in Chapel Hill, I found this letter that confirmed what I had always wondered, but never expected the record would finally reveal. And that is a personal relationship between Richards and Spencer that clearly documented the trust that defined their business relations. So my conclusion, right, was, okay, if Spencer is not sending, Richards regular directions, and Richards isn't reporting back the result of his work, then they must have some level of trust that they've created between the two to allow Richards as this agent to represent the railway in this way. And this letter to me confirmed that. So I'll just briefly read it, right? Personal, December 21st, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Mr. Spencer, at this late day, I wish to express my regrets that you were not reelected to the presidency of the B&O, which was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. I thank you for the very favorable manner in which you entertained my work and was hopeful that during the year 89, the department would accomplish results satisfactory to the company and at the same time gratify you personally. During the past few months, I came in contact with many people located along the lines of the B&O and universally sound, that word is a bit obscured, position in regard to local industries was highly complimented. And yours very truly, M.V. Richards. So let's learn a little more, right? The question then that this letter revealed, well, it confirmed, right, that these men had this supportive personal relationship. Well, the next question then is, what does he mean by entertained my work? And was hopeful, right, that this year they would accomplish results satisfactory to the company and at the same time gratify you personally. So the mystery, right, in some ways deepened with this letter. Okay. So this material comes from the Atlanta History Center, the business records of the Southern Railway run by Sam Spencer. And this is from a magazine that M.V. Richards published out of Baltimore, called the Southern States Farm Magazine, and we'll see a few pages from that in a moment. But the question here, right, is do you desire? And you can see this long list, right? Things like a valuable farm, a cotton plantation, a place for a truck farm, other forms of investment, right? So he says, if so, right, locate in the territory of the Southern Railway. And you can see Richards as the last name on this list of agents. So Richards would have overseen the other men on this list, as well as by 1897, a whole department of agents. And I know this from the annual reports of the Southern Railway that are also held there in Atlanta. Okay. So now is where we start to think about what this stuff means, right? Again, establishing the context for these records. So, and here's some of the arguments for my book. So at the same time that quote unquote hopelessly degraded Italians came to represent the nation's new immigration problem, this book and this larger project interrogates the origins of that immigration problem in the South, reframing debates over immigrant desirability, race, and public policy that defined the progressive era. So designed to permanently relocate Italian immigrants to the American South, which was in the 1890s and really until more recent decades, right, a region with a proportionally small foreign-born population. These proposals to quote unquote colonize, right, the Italians in the American South helped to shape debates over desirability during the Progressive Era, which was a period not much like our own, right, with grappling with policy solutions to what the media characterized, again, as an emerging immigration problem. So the American South served as a laboratory for transnational immigration policy, with Italian immigrants as experimental subjects in efforts by both the US and Italian governments to manage migration flows. And if, you know, from my bio, right, that's really the work that I've been doing to get to this point, to understand what these Southern records say. You have to tie them into the context of what the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs is doing at the same time. These policies for colonization and distribution policy, right, and the public and private influence campaigns that accompanied their discussion illuminate how ideas about race, class, and citizenship shaped who was considered desirable and how immigrants were distributed geographically, and how policymakers sought to mold immigrants to fit national and social needs. So as you can see from this, do you desire, right, the idea here is that quote unquote, right, good or desirable immigrants, even if they're described as undesirable in other places in other ways in the United States, for their Catholicism, for their propensity towards violence, both ways in which Italians were described at this time, that if they could be situated along a railroad, you know, on a truck farm, or on a plantation, that they could contribute positively to the economic development of the South, and to alleviating the problems in the cities where immigrants, particularly Italians at the time, were accumulating. So some of the most ardent advocates of Italian colonization were railroad men like M.V. Richards. So if we cut here to the next slide for a second, I've got some, you know, important dates in his life. You can see right in the middle of the timeline was that letter, which from context clues we know was written in 1889. And we also see, right, that soon afterwards, Richards, who was a railroad man through and through his entire life, professional life, that in 1895 he moves to Washington, D.C. and begins work from the very beginning of the organization of the Southern Railway, which is headquartered in Washington, as its land and industrial agent. And that 10 years after that, right, he's applying for a passport to travel to Italy for his recruiting work. And I thought one little tidbit was that he requested his passport be mailed to him in care of the Southern Railway offices in Washington. All right, and he dies in 1918. And we'll see a little bit of his obituary in a moment. Okay, so continuing onward, right? One thing also to tie this back to North Carolina history in particular, and some people on the call are listening to this later may be familiar with Valdez, North Carolina, which is actually from the Waldensians or Valdese. So that's a town, right, that's like in the Piedmont leading up into the mountains that was settled and by Italians who were also part of this colonization movement, although not explicitly initially tied to the railway. The Southern Railway, as this newspaper article from Morganton in 1905 says, right, the bottom, the Southern Railway Company is taking an active interest in the movement and looking for the settlement of 30 immigrants in the South. So one thing about this article is that it mentions Richards as one of the speakers on this trip conducted aboard the Southern Railway, organized by the Southern Railway, to take the Italian ambassador through the South to see these different locations where Italians had settled. Really, the earliest settlements that we see are like really mid 1890s, and they'll continue through the first decade and a half of the 20th century, including out near Wilmington, which is another part of this book. So if you're interested in that, read the book. But I won't dive into it here for the sake of time. So before, right, on the previous slide and in that letter, we saw some of the relationship that Richards had with Spencer. And we also start to see how we have to look elsewhere to understand how that relationship, not necessarily how it unfolded, that's still a little hard to say archivally, but how it influenced this movement for distribution policy and Italian colonization. So another thing, right, that we want to think about here as we keep going, and I apologize for the super text-heavy slides, but some of this language I'll guide us through, and it's just, I think, kind of critical to understand what's going on in the period. So when we're thinking about what work Richards did, and remember, Sam Spencer has kind of given him free rein to conduct this campaign with diplomats in the press and publications like we saw a moment ago, through visits. This is really pretty extensive promotion work. So in the Newberry, South Carolina Herald and News, right, 1911, we see this description of the men under Richard's department. And so it says here, right, the agents in charge of these offices, and these are all the sub-offices he oversees, they're geographically organized, give their assistance to all efforts to promote in any direction the growth of the territory adjacent to the railroad lines. Obviously, the emphasis here is mine. Find locations for industries or help in their organization. Aid homeseekers or colonizers in securing the lands they wish. Work with the farmers and others in solving the problems of markets or crops which come up. Gather information about the opportunities or facts which will advertise their districts, and in every possible way extend their cooperation and that of the railroad to the people of their territory in development efforts. So that's a mouthful, right? But we see how colonization is tied into a larger project for Southern economic development that I'm working on in my third book, and that I'll kind of conclude towards the end. So sort of leave you with that, hopefully buzzing a little bit with these connections. So we know from Richards' obituary that by his death in 1918, he was written as Mr. Richards has been characterized as the Dean of Railway Development and is the man largely responsible for the development of the industrial South. He was an authority on railway development questions and was a frequent speaker in the South on industrial conditions. So his career certainly was a triumph, according to the newspaper, the obituary. All right, as we continue, so this is the front page of the Do You Desire, right, that we saw, so we're looking now at the front page. Do You Desire is the inset, and then this is the facing page here. And again, this is material in the Southern Railway collection in Atlanta. But you see the little tag that was attached with M.V. Richards, talking about why one might be mailed this text. So now we can start to make some links in particular to the racial and economic history of the South, and the New South era in particular, right? The kind of booster era. So for railroad agents and like Richards and presidents of railroads like Sam Spencer, the facilitated emigration of Italians for the rural South. So that's what I'm talking about, right? Securing people and assisting them either with payments, contracts, or other assistance in purchasing land or working in the South. That type of facilitated immigration for Italians addressed urgent political, social, and economic problems. So as you can see from this December 1897 promotional magazine, and the tie also to the manufacturer's record, probably one of the most significant economic voices, if you will, on in the New South and on New South development, is this tied to the idea, right, that Black labor was unsuitable for the economic growth of the South. That argument really runs throughout a lot of promotional material in the New South era. But what we can see here, as well as we dig a little deeper into the longer history of this kind of promotion and think about it as linked to distribution policy, is that railroad boosters carefully painted Italians, right? These very same people characterized as a racially inferior danger in other parts of the country, instead as a desirable future citizenry in this focused media campaign that we've seen some evidence of here today. So recruitment efforts like those undertaken by Richards framed Italian railroad corporations and immigration through these recruitment efforts, right? Railroad corporations and immigration agents colluded to recruit and later to exploit Italian immigrants as labor to build the roads. But this work also helped to quote unquote whiten the South's socioeconomic landscape. So speaking to the significant historiography on racial capitalism, railroad corporations in the Gilded Age turned to white enough Italians to resist regulation and present capitalist expansion as both profitable and racially palatable. And this is work that I'm currently doing in my third book that I'm writing this year. But that as we go on to the end of the slideshow here, and I kind of start to wrap it up. Oh, there it is. Okay, so back to the letter, right? Come full circle. So what do I now know, right? You've accompanied me on this journey through a number of different sources. Did not feature any of my Italian sources, but again, that's where I first found M.V. Richards and started to wonder about him. So back to this letter that I found on that last day of research when I had not seen a single shred of evidence connecting Richards and Spencer, even though I knew from the Italian diplomatic archive that they had to have had an important relationship. So this letter confirmed for me finally that by 1900 or thereabouts, right, the relationship between railroad management and the land and labor agents of the most important roads in the period was pretty loose, right, pointing to the wide leniency that railroad presidents granted to these representatives to obtain Italian settlers on the company's behalf. So while this quasi-legal recruitment was purposely obscured in the corporate record, the things that I've shown you from Atlanta, the things from Wilson, right, are really kind of the only things that exist. There's not a lot of material on this on the American side. While it was purposely obscured, the relationship in the corporate record, it becomes legible when closely read and cross-referenced with other archives. Indeed, right, my discovery of the personal letter that we see here, sent by Richards to Spencer 4 years before Spencer organized the Southern and became its first president. This letter influenced the way I'm conducting my current research. And so my experience at Wilson, right, left a really lasting impression on my scholarship. So I'll say in conclusion, right, that the letter between Richards and Spencer that we're looking at right here, preserved in the Southern Historical Collection, encouraged me to read between the lines in the records of other Southern railroad corporations operating in the same period. And that's the title of this book, Between the Lines, that I'm working on this year. That book connects, right? My first, second, and third books really kind of form a triptych in exploring the relationship between Italy and the US in these critical years of mass migration and the emergence, right, of new policy approaches to controlling the freedom of people to move. So what I do know, right, is that the work that I conducted in Chapel Hill has pointed me to this new and fruitful approach to working with railroad collections and business history records that incorporates this kind of careful, close reading and cross-referencing that hopefully you got a sense of today. So since last June, I've uncovered even more tantalizing snippets of secretive campaigns to secure Italian immigration and regulations friendly to these plans, such as in Georgia. And this is inspired by what I discovered at Wilson Library. So I want to conclude there. Hopefully, again, you got a sense of the sort of research process, that kind of wonder, curiosity, and piecing together that's such a fundamental part of the work that I do, working transnationally as a U.S. historian, and that I hope inspires you also to ask questions and puzzle through and kind of dwell in the confusion and the curiosity that historical documents and archival records generate. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I think there are going to be I have questions. So I was wondering, does anybody have any immediate questions that they'd like to ask? And I mean, audience, or of course, Morgan or Lauren. And if not, we I can start. Hmm, okay. Um, I guess my first question is for Lauren, and this is probably just the personal sort of rising to the. So we have relatives, Italian relatives in the Northeast. Um, that this is an entirely so this is new migration. This isn't about transferring populations within. Interesting. And when I was thinking about that, I wanted to know a little bit more about the sort of business apparatus that the railroad would then wrap around these peoples, in terms of banking and support like that. I assume that there was a whole wealth of services that they were willing to sell. And the other thing that I was really interested in was how the Italian government was defining people that they were okay with having leave, or what was that a part? What was I mean, were they wholly passive, and these agents got to select communities that they thought would be viable, or was there sort of a guided intent to maybe depopulate certain people or areas or regions?
So that's a great question, both in thinking about the fact that this story of Italian migration does not line up, right, with what we typically know, both geographically, that we're talking about Italians into the American South, and that we're talking about Italians moving directly and not through the Ellis Island passageways that we're much more familiar with, or even into the typical kind of industrial occupations. We're talking about Italians going to farm. So the railroads were very good at this time in coordinating with shipping companies and hiring labor agents who often also sold tickets for those voyages in order to get the Italians to the very rural places that they wanted them to buy land. Um, and so they would offer mortgages. They would charge people for passage. Sometimes, in some cases, that turned into cases of peonage that the United States Department of Justice investigated. There was a big case of that in 1907 in Arkansas, in particular. In North Carolina history, right, Hugh McRae in Wilmington, he tries to do this work himself, and so he offers Italians to purchase land that he's organized that was on his personal land, and he also lends money from his banking house. But he's not entirely altruistic, right? Because he's an investor in the Atlantic Coast Railway, and he wants these people to be truck farmers who will ship their goods along that Atlantic Coast Railway. So there's always some degree, right, of kind of self-dealing in the railroads and what they're willing to sell to the immigrants. And then the worst case scenario, right, is that the things immigrants are charged or charged for become the impetus to lock them into conditions of peonage. So that's one answer to your question. The other one, right, is the Italian government. People are always really curious about this as well, right? The Italian government is very involved in tracing, following, and intervening in its migrants' lives abroad. Italians have a very high rate of return. Sometimes called birds of passage, as much as 50% rate of Italians will return. So the sense that a person was leaving and never coming back, or once they get to the United States, surely they'll settle permanently, but really as wasn't as much of a concern in this period. Later, it becomes even an issue, right, when we get to World War I and World War II with compulsory military service. But I have colleagues who've written about that, which is pretty interesting. So the Italian government wasn't passive, and they tried to pass a law in 1888 that didn't really work to control the flow. Migration is only growing and growing and growing. It peaks in 1906. At almost over 400,000 Italians entering the United States in that year alone. And that's when we've got about 1 million people coming per year total. So what the Italian government starts to do, though, in 1901 is they make a new law that governs labor agents, what they can do, how they can operate, and people like Richards kind of get caught up in this. and their efforts start to be questioned and controlled by the Italian government. So that hopefully that answers some of your questions. Thank you.
Yeah. No, that was great. Thank you. Um, Morgan, so I was wondering, one of the things I was thinking about, especially when you were reading and you were mentioning the not gratuitous, but the sort of the purposeful use of the word slavery as applied to people that were caught up in this form of institutionalization. It did make me wonder a lot. Um, I'll give an analogy. One of the things that I always thought was really interesting is that the language of eugenics that you can see in the 20s and 30s later sort of becomes flipped, where it seems to be largely focused on white populations and sort of husbanding a research to certain desired outcomes. It then becomes at least um, a part of the public discourse about segregation. I mean, these sort of arguments. And I found myself wondering if the theorists of slavery who talked about institutionalization, who talked about moral failings, who talked about economics, I wondered how that would play into the thinking of these same people that were constructing these institutions, especially I think in the wake of emancipation, when you probably see more institution building than you would have, previous to it.
Yeah, I haven't looked too much into it yet. I'm actually for my master's thesis reading a lot of texts that deal with slavery and texts from the 1800s. So I'm starting to get more of a sense of it. But I will say that part of my prior research on institutionalization and eugenics was on the treatment of Indigenous people, especially
Mm.
Indigenous women and children. And while not directly having to do with emancipation or slavery, I think we can see a lot of the relations between how institutions were largely influenced by racism and these racial structures in the United States. Um, so I don't know if that directly answers your question, but I will say also I found that use of slavery interesting in Packard's work, and I do want to investigate it further because when I was reading this book, I was seeing that while Packard was criticizing the institutions and her own stay at the institution, there were a lot of points in the novel where you could see through her rhetoric that she was kind of agreeing with these people should be institutionalized, but not me. Like, as a white woman, I shouldn't be institutionalized, but some people are okay. So I think that's something I want to delve more into as I further this research because while her book did a lot to highlight these injustices in the institutions, they also play into a lot of stereotypes about mentally ill people or people facing mental health crises and non-white people, people of color, especially women of color who are placed in these institutions. And so I think her use of slavery, there is a little like the line is kind of blurred on why exactly she was using it, which is why I was trying to find my own answer. But I think it'd be interesting to read. She actually published a second novel, a follow-up to this. So I would like to read that and see more on what language she's using there and if she talks further about slavery.
Interesting. And just for my own edification, the Henry Fielding that you mentioned is the author of Tom Jones?
Yes, yeah.
I'll have to, now I need to revisit Tom Jones. I'm curious about what themes may sort of be there that I had missed totally the first time when I was laughing.
Yeah,
Um,
I was trying to remember that because it's been since December, but I did do in December a little background research on Henry Fielding because
yeah.
of that and had seen that he had written Tom Jones.
One of the things, because your work is looking at sort of almost the professional literature, or at least it's not necessarily the lived lives of people that may have been incarcerated. Well, I know there's a novel, but there's so much artifice involved in that. I wondered, when you were here, did we talk at all about like Margaret Cameron Mordecai, who was, if not the first person that was enrolled in the Raleigh Asylum? She was very early and spent maybe 30 years there. And she's interesting because she comes from one of the wealthiest families in North Carolina, and there's a fair degree of correspondence kind of because of that, because the sorts of people that end up in an archive from that period tend to be anomalous and certainly much
Yeah.
richer than we would be, normal
Mhm.
folks. But
No, yeah.
if you would like to pursue that sort of voice, I think I can get that to you in a way
That
that.
would be great. Yeah, I think when I was there, it was an odd time because it was during the break. Um, but yeah, I definitely want to include more personal narratives in this project, especially from present day. I think it would be interesting to compare how personal narratives are using
Mm,
similar language in these two different time periods. But I kind of went into the archives for this project not really knowing what texts I was going to be looking at. Like I started with the research question and then went and looked at what texts are available at the archives at UNC and kind of formed my reading list that way instead of knowing there's this text there that I would like
yeah.
to go look at and form a research question from. So it definitely left it open for I don't really know what I'm going to find. So I'd be interested in looking at
Yeah.
more
Uh,
materials.
if you wouldn't mind, I'm actually traveling right now. If you could send me an email to that effect, like, hey, I'd be interested, it's just as a prompt, I can get those to
Yes,
you. I'd like to
I
say I
will.
remember, but the
Thank
other,
you so much.
oh yeah, the other question, Lauren, I was wondering about is so like in your look for Richards, um, are there, I was wondering about, does he appear in Archive Grid? Do you see him as a figure in other, the papers of other sort of industrialists or people that are interested in the South? I'm wondering if he doesn't live as a body of records, but ex lives as the occasional correspondent.
So yes and no. I mean, my work has always been this, even though I work in institutional archives, this sort of like needle in a haystack kind of discovery. So Richards was mildly prolific as a publisher of kind of what we would call advertorials, materials that were promotional but made to look like they were pieces of journalism, including like the Southern States Farm magazine. He collaborated often with Richard Edmonds of the Manufacturer's Record, probably from their Baltimore or his Baltimore days. He usually, when I look him up, he'll also show up in these little newspaper articles, or he'll show up in there's this industry publication called Railway World, where he would have features, so that he shows up in that way. He's a very occasional correspondent. And so he hasn't really hard to track down. And that was one major reason I came to Chapel Hill, because I was like trying to pin him down, knowing again, this is an era of business history where things are all conducted on paper, at least by telegram.
Yeah,
It's not an era where people are even really necessarily even talking on the phone. So that's where I was, went through, and particularly, like I said, he's not mentioned in any finding aid. So
hmm,
to discover him on that last day in the undated correspondence box was like, if I
yeah,
could have jumped up and down, I would have, without directing much attention to myself. But one thing that this kind of trying to finally pinpoint him through this one letter, and again, that question, like, how can one letter show so much? Hopefully, I've illustrated that. And is that it's led me to, I have a fellowship to visit the Newberry Library in Chicago that has the records of another really significant railroad corporation that had a different labor agent, and so
hmm,
I'm going to try to see if he exists in that corporate record as well. And even if he doesn't, I can use some of kind of this sort of cross-referencing to sort of see where he might be present under the surface as
yeah.
well. So yeah, if anyone ever listens to this and has any clues or is related to him, please reach out to me.
Right. There's a closet somewhere with all these letters. Um, well, great. Does anybody else, do you have questions for each other? Not to put you on the spot, but did you have anything that you'd want to ask before? Because we're almost at time.
I was curious, Morgan, having working as I do on immigration policy history, and seeing how particularly like from the very origins of the federal bureaucracy that managed border controls, there were these rationales that the leaders kept issuing, for not just the perpetuation of this new bureaucracy, but for increasing resources for it, for endowing it, in different ways. And so I was kind of curious as you were talking, I was thinking about the perpetuation of the kinds of asylum institutions that you were thinking about, and your curiosity with how that influences the way these structures work today. So I was just kind of curious, like how you see there are the arguments for the need for asylums, and if you have any thoughts about how that echoes in today's debate or anything, or if that strikes any thoughts in you.
Um, yeah, so like I said, I haven't quite gone into the modern day research portion yet, but I definitely from speaking or from my research and my studies in my public health program, a lot about of what we were talking about was that showed up in these texts in the archives was this kind of need to put people somewhere, that it's this idea that people need to be put somewhere if they don't make our society look good, or look good, is still really inherent in a lot of our structures in the United States. And we're really seeing that come up again. And I'm so glad that you asked this question because of your immigration perspective and your research on immigration. And also, I think labor was one that really stood out to me because we see this a lot now, especially with how we treat houseless people in the United States and people who are unable to work or can't find a job, or don't have a job that pays them enough money to have proper living conditions. And like I said, I have a background in disability studies too. So I think, especially when we look at how we treat disabled people who are unable to work due to their disability, that comes into play a lot. And reading these texts, it was like, wow, some of these ideas could have been written today, actually. Like this is how people talk about disabled people, about unhoused people, today. And it's, I think the like broader aspect of it is that we like to put things in neat boxes, especially in, well, looking from a United States perspective. And today, with our political climate, our politicians, our current leaders like to put things in these boxes because then they have control. And it really is all about control. And because of that, they think we need these systems of institutionalization. And even though they don't look the same, they're still there. Like prisons are institutions. It just looks different, or it looks similar, but is called something different. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you. Um, yeah, I mean, it's a good question, but of course unanswerable in terms of
Yeah.
that was
You know, I got too much of a rant there, but
a very good and interesting response to think about. Well, just in terms of, I'd like to thank you both. This is always really, honestly, one of the highlights of the experience for me is actually hearing you all articulate where you're at and where this has helped you, and also just learning about the collections in a very different way. Um, I'm sorry. After we wrap up here today with us, um, there is another research forum on November 12th, and Hooper Schultz from UNC is going to be talking, and his talk is called Campus Queens, Gay Liberation Activism at Southern Universities and College Towns. And Catherine Stein is going to be talking about the lad had a passion for history, the historiographical child in the archives. A few of you I saw had quick questions about how you get credit for this, and there should be a QR code in just a minute. And Nadia and I will stay on and we can answer specific questions if you have difficulty. But I would just like to invite Morgan and Lauren to keep in contact with us. And should you find something that you need from us, let us know. And if you see an elusive association that might be holding MV Richards somewhere in there, let us know. We're happy to take a look. And Lauren, I mean, and Morgan, I look forward to your follow-up, and I'll see what I can do in terms of finding the correspondence of Margaret Cameron and Mordecai. I think that'll be helpful, or at least interesting, I think, to flesh out. So thank you both. You're free to go while we deal with the administrative housekeeping.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much for
Yeah.
organizing this and for providing so much support for research, authentic research in the archives. I think it's so
Yeah.
valuable.
It's really our pleasure. It's so nice to have you for more than just a sort of a hit and run. It gives you a chance to find a letter on your last day instead of being disappointed on your third, or something like that. So, yeah, we'll take care of you too.
Thank you.
Bye, thanks.
Ah, all right. So Nadia has included the link. Nadia, that reads as for the November